Well, the title I've been given or chosen is Does Science Disprove God? And of course if I thought yes, I wouldn't be here. Not just because I wouldn't be giving this talk, but because I began as a scientist before I joined the order. I was trained at the one superior university of Oxford. My subject was organic chemistry, the kind that doesn't involve too much difficult mathematics. And in fact there is, I think, something of a continuity in my life, because I think my early interest in science was an interest in the way the world is and the way it works. And that went with an interest also in theology and religion, exploring the beauty and wonder of God's ways, the way he guides and rules the world. So wonder at the way the world is seemed to be a kind of continuity between science and an interest in religion in my life. Later on I developed more interest also in philosophy and psychology after joining the order. And there's also a certain continuity between organic chemistry and my liking for solemn liturgy, because both involve patterns and structures and movement, and colour, and smells. So before I want to get on to the issue of does science disprove God, I want to make one kind of preliminary point, but I think a quite important point, which is that science and the Catholic Church are basically on the same side. It's a false picture to think that there is a normative opposition between the Catholic faith and science. Basically, we stand for the same kind of thing. What does science stand for? What does the Church stand for? Well, one thing is the beauty of the world, and wonder at the beauty of the world. So scientists enjoy exploring the structures and patterns in the world. And the Church believes that the structures and patterns and beauty in the world reflect the beauty and wisdom of God. And God has given us a power of reason and intellect which is a dim reflection of his own much superior knowledge. He's given us the power to explore and understand, to some extent, the beauty and structure of the world. Of course, that raises the issue of the problem of evil. What do we do with the ugliness and suffering in the world? And that, I think, will be a topic for a later talk in this series, or maybe for discussion later this evening. Then, related to that, science obviously stands for the importance of human reason, but then so does the Catholic Church. The Church insists that her clergy study philosophy as well as theology, careful thinking, how to use reason, how people have used reason throughout history. And a great deal of Catholic moral theology involves the use of reason. Some people say too much use of reason. Of course, the Church believes many things that can't be proved by reason, things we think are revealed by God. But part of the work of theology is to show how, while the faith goes beyond reason, it's not against reason. And we seek to explore the beauty, and beauty goes with truth, the beauty of God's ways. On the other hand, science and the Church would be against things like superstition and magic, imagining that there are forces in the world for which there is no evidence or good grounds, like wearing green on Friday causes bad things to happen, and so on. We would be for trying to understand the forces of nature, respecting them, employing them, but not worshipping them. And then there's something else that science and the church both stand for, which is human well-being. Obviously, despite all sorts of mistakes and things like the atom bomb and so on, as a basic principle, science and technology seeks to improve human health and comfort. But then much of the Catholic Church's moral thinking is natural law morality, reflection on human nature, and what promotes real human well-being. So I think the Church is in principle a critical friend of science. And of course, you might then say, what about the Galileo affair? I have put at the back of the lecture room a paper I wrote 12 years ago now on, it's entitled Science and Faith. It was for a symposium published by Maryvale to help teachers and catechists think about how to present various issues in the new millennium. And I can make more copies during the tea break if you want more copies, but you're welcome to take them away and read them. I think I still like what I wrote. And I cite some evidence that the Galileo case was untypical. It was not part of the policy of the Inquisition. It was supposed putting pressure on the Inquisition to do something about Galileo because of a personal vendetta, because Galileo had rubbished a paper the Pope had written on the issue of whether Earth is the centre of the universe. So a miscarriage of justice, and scandalous, but not typical of the Church's attitude throughout the centuries. In that paper, I also refer to people like Peter Hodgson and Stanley Yarkey, who would argue that it's not just that science and the Catholic faith are basically on the same side. They're arguing that Christianity was the necessary kind of seed ground in which science could arise at all, because the medieval Christian worldview was that the world is orderly and interesting, and out of that gradually grew modern science. And one of our visiting fellows, Michael Tkach, will be here again next year, is working on a paper on the role of Albert the Great, teacher of St. Thomas and a Dominican. The role of Albert the Great in the rise of modern science. I think is more complex than I let on when I wrote that paper, because Aristotle, pagan philosopher, would have, well, was interested in what we now call modern science. Many of our disciplines were named by him. If he'd had the experimental technology, he might have discovered more truth about the world. And in fact, modern science was made possible by developments in technology in the 17th century. But one of the key people in technology was Robert Hooke, born on the Isle of Wight in 1635, studied in Oxford and worked with people like Robert Boyle, and then worked for the Royal Society, building experimental apparatus and helping discover the nature of light, and so on. And part of his formative influence was going to Westminster School in London, where he was formed in a high Anglican milieu that promoted the use of reason over against perceived Puritan fundamentalism under Cromwell. So this great experimental scientist, more important than is often realised, was formed again in a Christian milieu. So I think you may find counter-examples here and there, mistakes by scientists and obstruction by Christians. But I think basically the Church could be seen as the critical friend of science. And I say critical friend because we all of us need critical friends to whom we can show our dissertations for them to pull them apart and so on. Not every possible experiment, not every possible form of technology is good. We shouldn't simply and eagerly jump at every possible kind of experiment on human subjects or others. We shouldn't uncritically develop any and every possible technology or biotechnology. We have to reflect on whether something is moral or immoral, which often means humanizing or dehumanizing. We have to reflect on whether things are prudent, like whether it is sensible to develop nuclear reactors whose waste products can only be kept safely if civilization continues without lots of war and collapse for centuries. And I think the Church does have a moral tradition and a moral wisdom that should enable a respectful dialogue between faith and science about what is moral and what is humanizing and what isn't. So after that suggestion of a perspective where the Church is on the same side as science, but there should be dialogue and questioning, I want to move on to the question whether science does disprove the Christian faith. And I want to ask basically three questions, because there isn't time to explore any more. The first, has the development of science meant that we no longer need God? We can explain the world without having to have any recourse to the God hypothesis. Well, Aristotle, whom I mentioned, pagan philosopher, put forward a proof that God exists. One that St. Thomas Aquinas was to employ. And you could read it in different ways, but you certainly could read it as saying, look at the heavens and see that they move. Because the way the world looks, we're in the middle and the heavens go round us. And they knew the world was round and 8,000 miles across. They knew roughly how big and how distant the sun and the stars were. But it looks like they go round the earth, and it took a long time to realise it's not like that. Our experience here is that things move if you push them, and when you stop pushing, they grind to a halt. And they assumed, rightly, that the laws of physics are the same here and in the heavens. So, if the sun and the stars move, someone is pushing them. And it's the intelligences, or what St. Thomas would call the angels, and they do that job because God attracts them into doing that job for us. And in the 14th century, people began to develop the concept of inertia, the idea that the heavenly bodies might move without needing to be pushed. God gave them a kind of oomph when he made them, and they just kept going. You don't need the angels after all. And that leads eventually to Newton's laws of motion, and the picture that lots of people had from the 17th century of God as the great watchmaker. God crafts the cosmos, sets it going, and lets it run itself while he sits back. And being a good Oxford non doesn't interfere too often. So God's job is to set things going and then leave them. And then Stephen Hawking wrote his brief history of time some years ago, and he suggested that you don't need to determine the initial conditions of the cosmos. The mathematics determines not just how it will develop, but how it has to start. And everyone said, or at least the media said, Hawking has relieved God of his last job. You don't need God to start things off either. Well, St. Thomas has other proofs of the existence of God, and I think the most powerful one that would take some time to unpack in detail, it starts by wondering at the being of things. Given that things exist, like ants, and amoeba, and caterpillars, and so on, we can explore their structure. Given that the whole cosmos exists, we can explore its large-scale structure. But why is there anything at all? St. Thomas thought you couldn't argue from creation to any detailed conclusion about what kind of cosmos we live in. God could have made an infinite cosmos in time, or a limited one in time. You have to look and discover what kind of cosmos it is that God has made. And it would be quite interesting if the mathematics came out extremely neatly, the way Stephen Hawking thought they did. I think he's changed his mind slightly under the influence of Roger Penrose here, who's shown that maths can't ever explain absolutely everything. But why is there a cosmos at all? Why does anything exist at all? As I guess Peter was exploring last week. Julian of Norwich, lots of good things come from Norwich, like Julian and me. Julian had her vision of something small in the palm of her hand and wondered what it might be, and she was answered, "It is all that is made." I thought it might fall into nothing, it seems so small, and I was answered, "It lasts and ever shall, because God loves it." There's that vision, a rational and almost kind of mystical and more than rational vision of the precariousness of things. Why do they exist at all? Because God wills them to be. And in fact, in the brief history of time, that's the kind of question that Stephen Hawking did ask. The equations can describe the cosmos, but what makes there to be a cosmos, the equations describe. So God's job is not just to get things going, but to make things be all the time and at all. Why is there a cosmos that science can investigate and describe, and technology can employ? Because God wills it to be. So on that perspective, it's not that God plugs the gaps that science leaves, but God creates a world that science explores. God's job is not to plug any gaps that science can't explain. God's job, in inverted commas, is to cause the whole cosmos to exist and give us the power to explore it. So I see no conflict there between science and God. God makes things be, science explores them. But then there's one other issue that people puzzle over a great deal nowadays and argue over, and that's of course the theory of evolution. Isn't there a conflict between the theory of evolution and what the Bible says. And there are people who call themselves creationists who claim that they have an alternative biblical account of how things come to be, different from the theory of evolution. Well, they misuse the word creation. Creation is a matter of God making absolutely everything to be at all. To say, because cats and human beings are created, that means the first cat popped into existence in thin air, and then the first human being popped into existence in thin air. That's a misuse of the concept of creation. I am created. I was conceived by my parents Michael and Cynthia, but I'm held in being by God. So I was produced in a biological and more than biological process, but I am created. And the first cat and the first human beings were equally created, whether they popped into being in thin air or were born of pre-cat animals or pre-human animals. So an evolutionary world is still created. God creates a kind of world in which evolution happens. At the beginning of the Bible, the first few chapters of Genesis were never really taken by Jews or Christians to be watertight, neat, wooden accounts of the structure of the cosmos and its history. Those chapters take stories of the creation of the world and tweak them to say very important things about the world, about God, about human nature, and shouldn't be taken as an alternative to scientific discovery. One thing the beginning of the Bible does say is that human beings are made in the image and likeness of God. So we are distinct from the other animals in some way. And if Darwin's theory of evolution was the whole story, then I think there would be a conflict. Because Darwin's picture of evolution, even though he was a Cambridge man, was incomplete. He has this picture of the gradual accumulation of small changes. And that, of course, does happen. Budgerigars are typically yellow and green, like the first one we possessed at home, but by a mutation they can lose the ability to make yellow pigment, and our second budgerigar was white and blue. Some development of animals and plants is the accumulation of small changes like that. But that can't be the whole of the picture. If it were, there'd be no clear division between species and no clear division between pre-human and human animals. It would be difficult to hold the Christian view of a distinction between human beings and the other animals. But clearly, in the history of evolution, new species do come into existence alongside old ones, almost kind of ready-made, it seems. And new kinds of animals come into existence with different body plans. So starfish have a five-fold body plan, and we have, like many animals, a symmetrical two-fold body plan. And scientists are beginning to understand the mechanisms by which that kind of thing can happen. Because some genes code for little things, like the enzyme to make the yellow pigment in budgerigars, and some genes cause the control of the expression of other genes. and a small change in one of those control genes can have a big change in body plan. But apart from the X and Y chromosome, we have two versions, two copies of each gene. It would be possible for a mutated gene to develop and spread in a population and not be expressed, because animals only have one copy of the new gene and one of the old. And eventually the concentration builds up and animals begin to appear with two copies of the new gene and a new body plan or whatever. And suddenly there's a new species ready-made, recognizing each other and interbreeding. And if that change is successful, they survive. So it is scientifically possible for the human race to have appeared in the form, I guess, of a small number of human beings born of pre-human parents, as would happen for many other species. And there's enough of a jump between the human structure and the pre-human structure, we would say, to support a rational soul. So clearly, the Christian view of the human being goes beyond science, but not against science. It is possible to hold that the first human beings were a small group, distinct enough in their body structure, their brain structure, whatever, from their parents to form a new species, which at last is fully rational and in the image and likeness of God. And of course we want to say a lot of things that go beyond what evolution and science can say about human beings. We are in the image of the Holy Trinity. We are made to be temples of the Trinity, to rise from the dead and abide together in God. That goes beyond what science can deal with, but not, I think, against it. And so I want to move on, by kind of sequence, to a final question, briefly. Is there an incompatibility between the scientific view of human nature and the Christian view? Given that the Christian view goes beyond, does it go against the scientific view of human nature, physiology, psychology, and so on? Well, since the 17th century, and René Descartes, a lot of people in the West have assumed that the animal body is just a machine. Nothing more than a complex machine. Richard Dawkins says as much explicitly in his God Delusion. If there were a tiger in this room, I would pretend that it wants to eat me. It doesn't really have desires, it's not conscious in that way. It's a machine, but if I did the calculation about rays of light going into its eyes and all the mechanics moving, I'd be dead. So I pretend it wants to eat me. And for Descartes, the human body is just a machine, but ours is used by a kind of angel, like the driver in the tank, that uses the pineal gland as a kind of steering column in the brain. And then Gilbert Ryle of this university says we don't need the ghost in the machine. The complexity of the machine is enough to explain human nature. So if science did say clearly that the human body is basically a complex machine and nothing more, working by mechanical rules, there wouldn't really be any room for a spiritual soul or immortality or anything like that. I guess most of us saw pictures of atoms, diagrams of atoms rather, in our school chemistry textbooks. Looking at little solar systems with a little lump in the middle of the nucleus and little circles going round the electrons. If you think matter is little lumps of stuff, little billiard balls, then probably we are just machines. But the diagrams are misleading. Real quantum mechanics, real chemistry, does not allow us to think of atoms, or rather their components, as little billiard balls of hard stuff following purely mechanical rules. Electrons and protons and so on are much more like patterns of interaction located here or here. To some extent kind of caught up in and determined by the whole structure they contribute to and are part of, rather in the way Aristotle and St. Thomas saw the elements contributing to and caught up in the animal or human body. Because for Aristotle and St. Thomas, animals, not just humans, but other animals, are not machines. They're whole organisms with varying degrees of consciousness, the ability to interpret their environment and react to it. The tiger really does want to eat me. And an animal is a form of life, a single organism with its own being, its own form of life, rising far above mere materiality. And for St. Thomas, the human soul, the human form of life, is forming materiality into my structured living body, and doing more, thinking as well. And so I think St. Thomas has a much more subtle, intricate, realistic view of human psychology than many later philosophers. I've put at the back a chart of his view of the psyche and how many faculties we share with the animals. Their consciousness, their ability to interpret their environment and react to it. But he would see animals and human beings as having their own degrees of being caused by God in different degrees, so that you wonder at the beauty of the tiger, and if you like that kind of thing, you wonder at the beauty of the gorilla. Each a form of life which is more than the sum of its parts, and the human form of life is higher still, incorporating and going beyond that animal psychology. So I think the debate about things like human nature is not between science and Christianity, but two different views of the world, two different views of reality. Is the world made of lots and lots and lots of little bits, just strung together mechanically, a kind of flat, mechanical view, that can wonder at the complexity of things, but nothing more? Or do we have a kind of technicolor world ablaze with the glory of God, where many different kinds of things exist with their own form of being? Big things like planets, bigger things like stars, even more wonderful things like viruses and bacteria and fungi and plants and worms and tigers and gorillas and human beings. Each a form of life with its own wonder, its own structure, but being more than just the sum of a lot of mechanical parts. And I think you can do science, whichever worldview you have, but I think doing science in that second, more technicolor worldview is actually more exciting and ultimately more fruitful. And I would like to hope there could be, in the years ahead, an interesting dialogue between faith and science and psychology and philosophy about things like human nature. Of course, I think the time is ripe to get a more holistic and more wondering view of the thing that is human nature, where we can in fact contribute to each other getting a greater grip on ourselves and how we are made up and how we work. But that requires, I think, lurking in the scenes, some sense of God holding us in being in all the wonder that we have and are. So that's my time more than used up. I hope it's given you some food for thought and debate and discussion. Thank you.